Chapter 1. The Village Whisper. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its golden rays filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest drawing-room. She sat in her favourite armchair, a delicate teacup balanced in her hand, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. To an outsider she might have appeared the picture of serene retirement, but her sharp eyes, darting occasionally to the window, betrayed a mind ever alert to the rhythms of village life. It was a Thursday, and Thursdays in St. Mary Mead were market days, when the high street buzzed with gossip as much as commerce. Miss Marple had already heard snippets of news from her maid, Cherry, who had returned from the butcher's with a joint of lamb and a tale that piqued her interest. Over breakfast, Cherry had leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They're talking about the churchyard, Miss Marple," she'd said, her eyes wide. "Black roses, they say, growing right over the graves. Not planted by anyone, mind you, just appearing like they've got a mind of their own." Miss Marple had raised an eyebrow, her curiosity stirred. "Black roses, Cherry? How extraordinary! And which graves, pray tell?" Cherry had shrugged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Nobody's sure. Old ones, they reckon. Mrs. Price at the post office swears she saw them herself, blooming where no flowers ought to grow." Now, as Miss Marple sipped her tea, she pondered this peculiar rumour. Flowers, in her experience, often carried meaning, roses especially, with their coded language of love, grief, or secrecy. But black roses, they were rare, almost unnatural, and their sudden appearance in the churchyard suggested something more than a gardener's whim. St. Mary Mead was a quiet village, but Miss Marple knew better than most that quiet places often hid the deepest secrets. Setting her knitting aside, she rose and donned her straw hat, deciding a walk to the village shop would provide more clarity. The high street was lively, with farmers hawking vegetables and housewives exchanging news over baskets of apples. Miss Marple nodded politely to acquaintances, her ears attuned to any mention of the roses. It didn't take long. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bantry, Dolly Bantry, an old friend and one of the village's more colourful characters, was holding court. "It's downright eerie, if you ask me," she declared, clutching a tin of biscuits. "I walked past the churchyard yesterday, and there they were, black as night, growing over poor old Mr. Harrow's grave. And not a soul knows how they got there." Miss Marple approached, her smile mild but her interest keen. "Good morning, Dolly. I couldn't help overhearing. Black roses, you say, on Mr. Harrow's grave?" Mrs. Bantry turned, delighted to have a fresh audience. "Oh, Jane, you wouldn't believe it. They're not like any roses I've ever seen. Dark as ink and thriving, mind you, in that neglected corner of the churchyard. And it's not just Mr. Harrow's grave. Mrs. Price says she saw them on Widow Clement's plot too." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, her mind already sifting through possibilities. Mr. Harrow, she recalled, had been a dour widower who died some 15 years ago, his heart giving out after a lifetime of solitude. Widow Clements, on the other hand, had passed more recently, a kindly soul known for her herbal remedies. What could connect their graves to these mysterious blooms? "Has anyone spoken to the vicar?" Miss Marple asked, adjusting her gloves. "He might know if someone's been tending the churchyard." Mrs. Bantry snorted. "That old stick, Reverend Hale. He's half blind and wouldn't notice a rose if it sprouted in his pulpit. But you're right, Jane, someone ought to ask. It's unnatural, that's what it is." Miss Marple smiled faintly, filing away Mrs. Bantry's scepticism. Reverend Hale, while eccentric, was not as oblivious as some believed, and the churchyard was his domain. If anyone knew the history of those graves, it would be him. But first she resolved to see the roses for herself. As she made her way home, a basket of groceries in hand, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the nature of rumours. In St. Mary Mead, stories grew like weeds, often obscuring the truth beneath, layers of exaggeration. Yet something about these black roses felt different, a whisper of something darker, older, rooted in the village's past. She would visit the churchyard at dusk, when the light was softer, and secrets perhaps more willing to reveal themselves. Back in her drawing-room, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their rhythmic dance. But her eyes, sharp and thoughtful, lingered on the horizon, where the church spire stood sentinel over the graves. Black roses, she mused, flowers that only grew over graves. What story were they trying to tell? "Hold on, detective, before we proceed, reveal your location. Where are you uncovering these dark truths? Comment below. And if you dare to dive deeper into the shadows, subscribe now. Tomorrow's case plunges into even deeper darkness. Stay vigilant." Chapter 2. The Graveyard Discovery. As the sun dipped below the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village, Miss Jane Marple set out for the churchyard. She wore a sensible tweed coat against the evening chill, her straw hat replaced by a woolen scarf tucked neatly around her neck. In her hand she carried a small notebook and pencil, for Miss Marple was not one to rely solely on memory when clues might be afoot. The churchyard of St. Mary's was an ancient place, its weathered stones tilting like silent sentinels under the weight of centuries. Yew trees, gnarled and brooding, lined the path to the iron gate, which creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and fading summer blooms, but her attention was fixed on the far corner of the yard, where the older graves lay neglected, half swallowed by ivy. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning the headstones. Many were familiar, names of families long woven into the fabric of St. Mary Mead. But it was the black roses she sought, those strange flowers that had set the village abuzz. Following Mrs. Bantry's directions, she made her way to the grave of Mr. Harrow, its granite slab cracked but legible. And there they were. The roses were unlike anything Miss Marple had ever seen. Their petals were a deep, velvety black, absorbing the fading light rather than reflecting it. They grew in tight clusters, their stems thorned and sturdy, rooted directly in the soil above the grave. No sign of planting, no disturbed earth, no gardener's tools, suggested they had been placed by human hands. Miss Marple knelt, careful not to crush the flowers, and peered closer. The roses seemed to thrive in the barren patch, their dark beauty stark against the grey stone. "Remarkable," she murmured, jotting a note in her book. She sketched the shape of the petals, noting their unnatural sheen. Then, recalling Mrs. Bantry's mention of Widow Clements, she sought out the second grave, a modest plot some yards away. Sure enough, the same black roses bloomed there, their eerie symmetry mirrored across the two sites. Miss Marple stood, her brow furrowed. 2 graves, both marked by these flowers, yet no obvious connection between Mr. Harrow and Widow Clements. Or was there? She paced the churchyard, her sharp eyes searching for other signs of the roses. To her surprise, she found a 3rd cluster, this time over the grave of a Miss Eliza Thorne, who had died some 20 years prior. Miss Marple paused, her memory stirring. Eliza Thorne had been a spinster, much like herself, but reclusive, known for her sharp tongue and solitary habits. Her death, if Miss Marple recalled correctly, had been sudden. A fall down the stairs, the village had said. The roses on her grave were smaller, less vibrant, but unmistakably the same. 3 graves, 3 sets of black roses. Miss Marple tapped her pencil against her notebook, her mind sifting through possibilities. Were the roses a natural phenomenon, some rare species carried by the wind? Or were they a deliberate mark, a message left by someone with knowledge of these deaths? She thought of the village gossip, how it often hid truth in plain sight. If these flowers were indeed tied to graves, there might be a pattern, a story buried with the dead. As she lingered, the church bell tolled 7, its sombre tone echoing across the yard. Miss Marple glanced up, noticing a figure in the distance, man stooped and weathered, tending a patch of marigolds near the church wall. She recognized him as Tom Griggs, the churchyard's gardener, a man of few words but deep knowledge of the soil. Perhaps he had seen something, noticed a stranger tending these graves. "Mr. Griggs," she called softly, approaching with her usual gentle smile. "Good evening. I couldn't help but notice these extraordinary roses. Have you seen them before?" Tom straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. His face, lined and sun-browned, betrayed a flicker of unease. "Aye, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "Them roses, they ain't natural. Showed up a few weeks back, just like that. I ain't touched 'em, mind. They grow where they please." Miss Marple tilted her head, studying him. "Only on these graves, it seems. Mr. Harrow, Widow Clements, and Miss Thorne. Do you know of any others?" Tom hesitated, his eyes darting to the roses. "Might be 1 or 2 more, over by the old yew. But I don't go prying. They give me the chills, they do." "Thank you, Mr. Griggs," Miss Marple said, her tone kind but firm. "If you notice anything else, anyone tending these flowers perhaps, you'll let me know." He nodded, though his expression suggested he'd rather forget the roses entirely. Miss Marple bid him good night and turned back to the graves, her mind racing. The roses were no accident, she was certain. They were a sign, a thread in a tapestry she had yet to unravel. As she left the churchyard, the last light fading, she resolved to speak with Reverend Hale. If anyone knew the history of these graves, or the secrets they held, it would be the vicar. Chapter 3. The Vicar's Tale. The following morning, Miss Jane Marple set out for the vicarage, her steps brisk despite the early hour. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and wood smoke, and the village of St. Mary Mead was just stirring to life. She clutched her notebook, now filled with sketches of the black roses and notes on the graves they marked. Mr. Harrow, Widow Clements, and Miss Eliza Thorne. The discovery of a possible 4th grave near the old yew tree, hinted at by Tom Griggs, lingered in her mind. But first she needed the vicar's perspective. Reverend Hale's vicarage stood adjacent to St. Mary's Church, a rambling stone house half covered in ivy. Miss Marple knocked, and after a moment the door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Hale, the vicar's bustling wife, her apron dusted with flour. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," Mrs. Hale said, wiping her hands. Come in, come in. The Reverend's in his study as usual, buried in his books." Miss Marple smiled, stepping into the cosy hall. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale. I'd like a word. With the Reverend, if he's not too busy. It's about the churchyard." Mrs. Hale's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Those roses, I'll wager. Everyone's talking about them. I'll fetch him." Moments later, Miss Marple was ushered into the vicar's study, a cluttered room lined with shelves of theological tomes and parish records. Reverend Hale, a wiry man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, looked up from a yellowed manuscript. His face, though kind, bore the weight of years spent tending to souls and secrets. "Miss Marple," he said, rising stiffly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Good morning, Reverend," she replied, settling into a chair. "I've been hearing tales of black roses in the churchyard, quite extraordinary ones growing only over certain graves. I wondered if you might know anything about them." The vicar's expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his features. He adjusted his spectacles and leaned back, steepling his fingers. "The black roses, yes. I've seen them myself. Most peculiar. They appeared some weeks ago, as if conjured from the earth. I confess, I've no explanation for their presence." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes sharp. "They grow on the graves of Mr. Harrow, Widow Clements, and Miss Eliza Thorne, and possibly others. Do you recall anything unusual about those individuals or their deaths?" Reverend Hale hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window overlooking the churchyard. "The graves you mention, they're old, some older than my time here. Mr. Harrow, I believe, died of heart failure. Widow Clements, poor soul, passed in her sleep. Miss Thorne, her death was a tragedy, a fall if memory serves. But as for a connection—" He trailed off, frowning. Miss Marple sensed there was more. "Reverend, you've been in St. Mary Mead for many years. Surely you've heard stories, legends perhaps, about the churchyard or its flowers?" The vicar sighed, his shoulders sagging. "There is an old tale," he admitted, his voice low. "Not one I care to repeat, for it's grim and likely fanciful. Long ago, before my time, there was a tragedy in the village, a series of deaths, sudden and unexplained. The story goes that black roses bloomed where the victims were buried, as if marking their graves with a curse. The villagers called them the mourners' roses, believing they grew from grief or something darker." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her notebook. "A curse, you say? And who were these victims?" Reverend Hale shook his head. "The records are vague, and the tale is half forgotten. It centred on Blackthorn Manor, the old estate beyond the village. The Blackthorn family, they say, was at the heart of it, wealthy, reclusive, and plagued by misfortune. But that was over a century ago, Miss Marple. Surely it's coincidence." "Coincidence is a rare thing in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple," said softly, her mind already turning to Blackthorn Manor. She knew of the estate, now crumbling and abandoned, its last occupants long gone. "Have you noticed anyone tending the roses, Reverend? or visiting those graves?" "No one," he said firmly. "Tom Griggs tends the churchyard, but he swears he's not touched them. And I've seen no strangers lingering. The roses, they seem to grow of their own accord." Miss Marple nodded, jotting a note. "Thank you, Reverend. You've been most helpful. Might I trouble you for access to the parish records? I'd like to look into the histories of those buried beneath the roses." "Of course," he said, rising. "I'll have them brought to the vestry this afternoon. But, Miss Marple, a word of caution. The roses, they unsettle people. Be careful what you stir up." She smiled, her expression serene, but her eyes alight with purpose. "I always am, Reverend." As she left the vicarage, the church bell chimed, its echo lingering in the morning air. Miss Marple's thoughts were on Blackthorn Manor and the mourners' roses. A curse, the vicar had said. She didn't believe in curses, but she did believe in human nature, its passions, its betrayals, and its secrets, often buried but never truly gone. The parish records would be her next step. But already she felt the threads of a mystery tightening, like the thorns of those blackened blooms. Chapter 4. A Curious Letter. Miss Jane Marple returned to her cottage after her visit to the vicarage, her mind abuzz with the vicar's tale of the mourner's roses and the shadowy history of Blackthorn Manor. The morning was still young, and she settled at her writing desk, intending to review her notes before heading to the vestry to examine the parish records. The black roses, with their eerie beauty and selective growth, were no mere quirk of nature. She was certain of it. They were a clue, a silent witness to something long buried in St. Mary Mead. As she reached for her notebook, a soft thud at the front door drew her attention. Cherry, her maid, was in the kitchen, humming as she polished silver, so Miss Marple rose and opened the door herself. On the doorstep lay a plain envelope, unaddressed and unsealed, its edges slightly crumpled, as if delivered in haste. She glanced up and down the lane, but the street was empty, save for a tabby cat slinking along the garden wall. Stooping carefully, Miss Marple retrieved the envelope and returned to her desk. Inside was a single sheet of cheap paper, the kind sold at the village shop, bearing a brief message scrawled in black ink. The handwriting was uneven, as if written under duress, and the words sent a chill through her. "Leave the roses be, Miss Marple. Some graves are best left undisturbed. The mourner's curse is real." She read the note twice, her lips pursing. Anonymous letters were not uncommon in village life. Petty grievances or spiteful warnings often found their way to doorsteps. But this was different. The mention of the mourner's curse echoed Reverend Hale's story, suggesting the writer knew more than idle gossip. And how did they know she was investigating? Her inquiries had been discreet, shared only with Mrs. Bantry, Tom Griggs, and the vicar. "Cherry," Miss Marple called, folding the letter carefully. "Did you see anyone at the door just now?" Cherry appeared, drying her hands on a tea towel. "No, miss. Been in the kitchen all morning. Why? Something wrong?" Miss Marple held up the envelope, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. This was left on the doorstep. No postmark, no name. "Tell me, Cherry, has anyone in the village been asking about me lately? Anyone curious about my comings and goings?" Cherry frowned, thinking. "Not that I've heard, miss. But you know how folk talk. Mrs. Price at the post office was on about the roses yesterday, saying you'd been asking questions. Could be someone overheard." Miss Marple nodded, dismissing Cherry with a kind smile. Mrs. Price was a notorious gossip, and news travelled fast in St. Mary Mead. Still, the letter's tone suggested more than village chatter. It was a warning, perhaps a threat, and Miss Marple was not one to ignore such things. She tucked the note into her notebook, resolving to keep it close. Whoever wrote it had revealed something vital. The roses were tied to a secret someone was desperate to protect. Determined to press on, she donned her coat and headed for the vestry, where Reverend Hale had promised to leave the parish records. The church was quiet, its stained glass windows casting jewelled light across the pews. In the vestry, a dusty ledger awaited her, its pages brittle with age. Miss Marple settled at a small table, her fingers tracing the faded ink as she searched for the names of those buried beneath the roses. Mr. Harrow's entry was brief. Jonathan Harrow, died 1910, aged 62, heart failure. Widow Clements was equally sparse. Margaret Clements, died 1920, aged 70, natural causes. Miss Eliza Thorne's record noted her death in 1905, aged 48, accidental fall. Miss Marple paused, her pencil hovering. Accidental, the record said, but village memory often held more than official documents. She recalled whispers at the time, speculation that Eliza's fall hadn't been an accident, though nothing was ever proven. She turned to older records, seeking the fourth grave Tom Griggs had mentioned near the yew tree. After some searching, she found it. Samuel Blackthorne, died 1885, age 35, cause unknown. The name stopped her cold. Blackthorne, like the manor. The vicar had mentioned the family's tragic history, tied to the legend of the mourner's roses. Samuel's death, with no cause listed, was unusual for a man so young. She noted the date and name, her mind racing. As she closed the ledger, a shadow fell across the table. She looked up to find Reverend Hale in the doorway, his face pale. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "I thought you should know. I found another rose this morning, on a grave I hadn't noticed before. It's unsettling." "Whose grave, Reverend?" she asked, rising. "Mary Blackthorne," he said softly. "Samuel's sister. Died in 1886, a year after him." Miss Marple's heart quickened. 2 Blackthorns, both marked by the roses, and a century-old legend that refused to fade. The anonymous letter's warning echoed in her mind, but so did her resolve. "Thank you, Reverend," she said. "I think it's time I paid a visit to Blackthorne Manor." As she left the church, the weight of the letter in her pocket felt heavier, but Miss Marple's step was firm. The roses were speaking, and she intended to listen. Chapter 5. The Old Manor's Secrets. Miss Jane Marple set out for Blackthorne Manor the next afternoon, her umbrella in hand as a precaution against the gathering clouds. The manor lay a mile beyond St. Mary Mead, its silhouette a grim relic on the horizon, half hidden by overgrown oaks and brambles. The anonymous letter, still tucked in her notebook, weighed on her thoughts, but so did the names from the parish records. Samuel and Mary Blackthorne, their graves now marked by the same black roses as the others. The connection to the manor was no coincidence, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover what secrets its walls might hold. The path to the manor was rutted and neglected, forcing her to pick her way carefully over stones and roots. As she approached, the house loomed larger. A once grand Georgian structure, its windows boarded, its stone facade cracked and streaked with moss. The gardens, long untended, were a tangle of weeds, though Miss Marple noted with interest a few withered rose bushes, their thorns sharp despite their decay. None, however, were black. She reached the front door, its paint peeling, and tested the handle. Locked, as expected. Undeterred, she circled the manor, her sharp eyes scanning for an entry. At the rear, near a collapsed conservatory, she found a window with a broken board, its glass long gone. With surprising agility for her age, she pushed the board aside and climbed through, landing lightly in what appeared to be a dusty parlour. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and time. Furniture draped in tattered sheets stood like ghosts in the dim light, filtering through cracks in the boards. Miss Marple moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled on the warped floorboards. She had no clear plan, only a sense that the Blackthorn, family's history, perhaps the key to the roses, lay within these walls. In the hall, a grand staircase spiraled upward, its banister coated in dust. She ascended, pausing to examine faded portraits on the walls. One depicted a stern man in Victorian attire, his eyes cold and piercing. The plaque read, "Edward Blackthorn, 1840–1890. Another showed a young woman, her face pale and sombre, labelled Mary Blackthorn, 1860–1886. Miss Marple's breath caught. Mary, whose grave now bore the roses. The portrait's expression hinted at sorrow, or perhaps fear. At the top of the stairs, she found a series of rooms, most stripped bare. One, however, appeared untouched, a study, its desk littered with papers brittle with age. Miss Marple sifted through them, finding ledgers, letters, and a crumbling map of the estate. One letter, addressed to Samuel Blackthorn, caught her eye. The handwriting was elegant but urgent, dated 1885, the year of his death. "Samuel, you must leave. The truth will destroy us all. Meet me at the yew tree midnight." E. The initial E intrigued her. Edward Blackthorn, perhaps, or another. The mention of the yew tree near where Samuel's grave lay was no coincidence. She tucked the letter into her notebook, her mind racing. A meeting, a warning, and a death soon after. The pieces were beginning to align. As she searched further, a faint creak echoed from downstairs. Miss Marple froze, her heart quickening. The manor was supposed to be abandoned, yet the sound suggested otherwise. She slipped to the door, peering down the staircase. Shadows moved in the hall below, too fleeting to identify. A trespasser? Or someone who knew she was here? With practiced calm, she retreated to the study, hiding behind a heavy curtain. Moments later, footsteps, slow, deliberate, ascended the stairs. They paused outside the study, and Miss Marple held her breath, her hand tightening on her umbrella. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, their face obscured by the dim light. They moved to the desk, rifling through the papers she'd left. "Who's there?" Miss Marple said sharply, stepping from her hiding place, umbrella raised like a weapon. The figure spun, startled, revealing a young man, no older than 30, with a pale face and wide eyes. I didn't mean no harm," he stammered, raising his hands. "I'm just looking for something." Miss Marple lowered her umbrella slightly. her gaze piercing. "And what might that be in an abandoned manor? I'm Miss Marple, and I'd like an explanation." The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. "Name's Daniel. I heard about the roses, same as everyone. Thought there might be answers here. Old stories, you know, about the Blackthorns." Miss Marple studied him, noting his worn coat and nervous demeanour. A villager, perhaps, but his presence here suggested more than idle curiosity. "And did you send me a letter, Daniel, warning me to leave the roses alone?" His eyes widened. "No, ma'am, I swear it. I know the stories, the mourner's curse. My gran used to talk about it. Said the Blackthorns were cursed, every one of them." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her mind remained alert. "Then perhaps you'll tell me what you know, Daniel, and why you're sneaking about Blackthorn Manor." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Not here, ma'am. It ain't safe. Meet me at the pub tomorrow, and I'll tell you what I know." Before she could press him, Daniel bolted, his footsteps echoing as he fled down the stairs. Miss Marple sighed, returning to the desk. She gathered a few more papers, including a faded photograph of the Blackthorn family, and made her way out, her thoughts on Daniel's fear and the letter's warning. The manor had yielded clues, but also new questions. As she stepped into the gathering dusk, the wind carried a faint scent of roses, though none grew nearby. Chapter 6. The Gardener's Confession. The morning after her venture to Blackthorn Manor, Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. Her notebook lay open, filled with new entries: the cryptic letter to Samuel Blackthorn, the photograph of the sombre family, and Daniel's hurried promise to share what he knew. The encounter in the manor had left her wary, but the young man's fear seemed genuine. She would meet him at the pub as agreed, but first she had another lead to pursue. Tom Griggs, the churchyard gardener who had admitted the black roses, unnerved him. Miss Marple found Tom in the churchyard, kneeling by a bed of marigolds, his hands caked with soil. The morning sun cast long shadows across the graves, and the black roses, still blooming over their chosen plots, seemed to gleam with an unnatural sheen. She approached quietly, her straw hat shielding her eyes from the glare. "Good morning, Mr. Griggs," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to speak with you about the roses again." Tom looked up, his weathered face tightening. He wiped his hands on his apron and stood, glancing at the nearest cluster of black blooms as if they might overhear. "Morning, Miss Marple. I told you before, them roses ain't my doing. They just grow." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile encouraging. "So you said. But you've been tending this churchyard for years, Mr. Griggs. You must have noticed something. Someone visiting the graves, perhaps, or tending the roses when no one was about." Tom shifted, his eyes darting to the church. For a moment she thought he might brush her off, but then he sighed, his shoulders sagging. "All right, Miss Marple, I'll tell you, but you won't like it. I've been looking after them roses, not planting 'em, mind, but keeping 'em healthy, watering 'em, pruning the dead bits. Didn't want to, but I had to." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose, though her expression remained calm. "Had to, Mr. Griggs? Why is that?" He lowered his voice, stepping closer. "It's the way they grow, miss. They don't act like normal flowers. If I don't tend 'em, they spread, creeping over other graves, choking out the grass. I tried pulling 'em once, but the next day they was back stronger, like they're alive in a way I can't explain." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her notebook, her mind racing. "That's most curious. And you've no idea where they came from? No one asked you to care for them?" Tom shook his head, his unease palpable. "No one, I swear. But there's something else. A few weeks back, when the roses first showed up, I found a note tucked under a stone by Mr. Harrow's grave. It just said, 'Keep them alive.' No name, no nothing. I thought it was a prank, but then the roses kept growing, and I got scared. Ooh. So I did what it said." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another anonymous note, much like the one left, at her door. "Do you still have the note, Mr. Griggs?" He nodded, reaching into his pocket to produce a crumpled scrap of paper. The handwriting was similar to her own letter, uneven, hurried, in black ink. "Keep them alive." She studied it, noting the cheap paper, identical to hers. Someone was orchestrating this, ensuring the roses thrived while warning her to stay away. "Thank you, Mr. Griggs," she said, handing the note back. "You've been very helpful. One last thing. Have you seen a young man named Daniel around the churchyard? Fairly tall, pale, perhaps acting nervous." Tom frowned, thinking. "Can't say I have, miss. But I don't always notice folk coming and going. The churchyard's quiet most days." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning to her meeting with Daniel. "If you see him, or anyone near the roses, will you let me know? And please, keep this between us." "Aye, miss," Tom said, though his eyes lingered on the roses with a mix of dread and resignation. As Miss Marple left the churchyard, she felt the weight of the mystery deepening. The roses weren't just a phenomenon. They were being preserved, deliberately, by someone who knew their significance. The note suggested a hidden hand, perhaps the same person who feared her investigation, and Daniel, with his talk of the mourner's curse, might hold the next piece of the puzzle. That evening she made her way to the Blue Boar, the village pub, where Daniel had promised to meet her. The pub was lively, filled with farmers and locals, sharing pints and gossip. Miss Marple found a quiet corner, her eyes scanning the room. Daniel arrived late, his coat damp from a sudden drizzle, his face pale and tense. "Miss Marple," he said, sliding into the seat opposite her. "I'm sorry about running off yesterday. I was scared, being in the manor like that." "I understand," she said, her tone kind but probing. "Now, you mentioned stories about the Blackthorns. What did your grandmother tell you?" Angel leaned in, his voice low. "She said the Blackthorns were cursed, ever since a betrayal in the family long ago. Someone was killed, murdered, she reckoned, and the roses started growing on their graves. Gran said they mark the dead who was wronged, like a sign of vengeance. She warned me never to go near Blackthorn Manor, said it's haunted by them." "What died?" Miss Marple listened, her mind sifting through his words. "And do you believe her, Daniel, about the curse?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't, not till them roses showed up again. Now, I'm not so sure. And I saw something else, Miss Marple. Last week, late at night, I was passing the churchyard. There was a figure cloaked, standing by one of them graves. Didn't see their face, but they was holding a black rose." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Which grave, Daniel?" "Samuel Blackthorn's," he said, shivering. "I ran before they saw me." She nodded, her thoughts racing. A cloaked figure, the notes, the roses, all pointed to someone guarding a secret, tied to the Blackthorn family. "Thank you, Daniel. You've been very brave. If you see that figure again, come to me at once." As Daniel left, Miss Marple sipped, her tea, her mind on the churchyard. The roses were a message, and someone was ensuring they were heard. She would return to the graves, perhaps at night, to catch this mysterious figure herself. Chapter 7. A Pattern. Emerges Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room the following morning, her notebook open on her lap, the anonymous letter and Tom Griggs's note laid out before her. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room, but her thoughts were far from cosy. Daniel's account of a cloaked figure in the churchyard, holding a black rose by Samuel Blackthorn's grave, had sharpened her focus. The roses, the notes, the Blackthorn family's tragic history, they were threads in a tapestry, and Miss Marple was beginning to see the pattern. She reviewed her notes, tracing the names of the graves marked by the roses: Jonathan Harrow, Margaret Clements, Eliza Thorne, Samuel Blackthorn, and Mary Blackthorn. Each death, as recorded, seemed natural or accidental. Heart failure, natural. Causes a fall. Yet the roses suggested otherwise. Daniel's grandmother's tale of a betrayal and murder, tied to the mourner's curse, hinted that these deaths might not be as innocent as the parish records claimed. Miss Marple knew that village memory, though often muddled, could hold truths official documents overlooked. Rising, she donned her coat and scarf, determined to revisit the churchyard. The morning was overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain, and the village was quiet as she made her way to St. Mary's. The churchyard was deserted, save for a lone crow perched on a headstone. Miss Marple approached the graves, her eyes scanning for new clues. The black roses still bloomed, their dark petals vibrant against the grey stones, but something caught her attention. A faint disturbance in the soil near Samuel Blackthorn's grave, as if it had been recently turned. She knelt, careful not to disturb the earth, and noticed a small, deliberate mark in the dirt. A crude etching of a rose, no larger than a shilling. It was fresh, likely made the night Daniel saw the cloaked figure. Miss Marple sketched it in her notebook, her mind racing. A signature, perhaps, or a ritual. Whoever was tending the roses was leaving marks, tying themselves to the graves in a way that felt almost ceremonial. She moved to the other graves, checking each in turn. Similar etchings, fainter but present, marked the soil near Widow Clement's and Eliza Thorne's plots. Mr. Harrow's and Mary Blackthorn's graves bore no such marks, but the roses there were newer, their stems less woody, suggesting they had bloomed later. Miss Marple paused, her pencil tapping against the page. A sequence, then. The roses and the marks were appearing in a specific order, as if following a plan. Back at her cottage, she spread out her notes and the Blackthorn family photograph from the manor. The image showed Edward Blackthorn, stern and imposing, with Samuel and Mary at his side, their faces pale and strained. A fourth figure, a woman in her 30s, stood slightly apart, her expression unreadable. The back of the photograph bore a faded inscription, Blackthorne Family, 1884. Edward, Samuel, Mary, and Eleanor. Eleanor, Miss Marple noted, could be the E from the letter to Samuel, urging him to flee. She turned to the parish records she'd copied, cross-referencing the deaths. Samuel Blackthorne, 1885, cause unknown. Mary Blackthorne, 1886, cause unknown. Eliza Thorne, 1905, accidental fall. Jonathan Harrow, 1910, heart failure. Margaret Clements, 1920, natural causes. The dates spanned decades, but the Blackthorne deaths were the earliest, clustering around the time of the supposed curse. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. What if the later deaths, Thorne, Harrow, Clements, were connected to the Blackthorne's tragedy, perhaps as consequences or cover-ups? To test her theory, she recalled village gossip from years past. Eliza Thorne's fall had been questioned. At the time, some whispered of a quarrel with a neighbour, though no proof emerged. Jonathan Harrow, a solitary man, had been rumoured to hoard secrets, his heart failure sudden for someone with no known ailments. Widow Clements, kindly but private, had once been linked to the Blackthorne estate, perhaps as a maid or herbalist. Miss Marple's memory, sharp as ever, pieced together these fragments, each person tied, however loosely, to the Blackthornes or their manor. The pattern was clear now. The roses marked graves of those whose deaths, though officially mundane, carried a shadow of doubt, deaths potentially linked to a betrayal or crime in the Blackthorne family's past. The cloaked figure, the notes, the etchings, all suggested someone was reviving this history, ensuring the roses bloomed as a reminder or accusation. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her resolve firm. The Blackthorne Manor held more answers, particularly about Eleanor, whose role in the family remained unclear. She would return to the manor, searching for documents or diaries that might name the betrayed or the betrayer. But first, she needed to identify the cloaked figure. Daniel's sighting suggested they visited at night, and Miss Marple, though cautious, was not above a midnight vigil. As she prepared for the day, a knock at the door startled her. Cherry answered, returning with a troubled expression. "Miss Marple, it's Mrs. Bantry. She says there's been a new rose in the churchyard, on a grave no one expected." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Which grave, Cherry?" "Old Mrs. Langley's," Cherry said. "Died 10 years ago, peaceful like, but now there's a black rose, fresh as you please." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already racing. Another grave, another death to investigate. Mrs. Langley, she recalled, had been a gossip, always hinting at scandals she never quite revealed. The pattern was growing, and with it the urgency to uncover the truth before the roses claimed another. Chapter 8. The Hidden Diary. Miss Jane Marple wasted no time after Mrs. Bantry's news of a new black rose on Mrs. Langley's grave. The pattern she'd uncovered, graves marked by roses, each tied to a death with a whisper of doubt, was growing, and the appearance of yet another bloom heightened her sense of urgency. Mrs. Langley, a notorious gossip who died a decade ago, fit the emerging profile. Someone whose life or death might connect to the Blackthorne family's dark history. But to confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple needed more than parish records or village rumours. She needed the Blackthorne's own words. Determined to uncover more, she resolved to return to Blackthorne Manor. The crumbling estate had already yielded clues. the letter to Samuel, the family photograph. But Miss Marple suspected its secrets ran deeper, perhaps hidden in personal writings or forgotten relics. She set out at midday, her umbrella tucked under her arm, her notebook secure in her pocket. The sky was heavy with clouds, casting a sombre light over the manor's jagged silhouette as she approached. This time she entered through the same broken window at the rear, her movements swift and purposeful. The parlour was as she'd left it, shrouded in dust, but she bypassed it, heading straight for the upper floors. The study where she'd found the letter was a start, but she recalled the manor's attic, glimpsed during her last visit through a half-open door at the end of the hall. Attics, in her experience, were treasure troves of forgotten things. Letters, diaries, secrets no one thought to destroy. The staircase to the attic was narrow and creaked under her weight, but Miss Marple climbed steadily, her eyes scanning for signs of recent disturbance. At the top, she found a low-ceilinged space cluttered with trunks, broken furniture, and stacks of mouldering books. Cobwebs draped the rafters, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. She moved carefully, her gloved hands lifting lids and sifting through papers. In a corner, half buried under a pile of moth-eaten curtains, she found a small, locked chest, its brass fittings tarnished but intact. The lock was simple, and Miss Marple, with a hairpin and a touch of ingenuity honed by years of quiet observation, coaxed it open. Inside lay a bundle of letters, a locket and a leather-bound book, its cover embossed with the initials E.B. Eleanor Blackthorne, she presumed, the mysterious woman from the photograph. Miss Marple opened the book, revealing pages filled with elegant, slanting handwriting. It was a diary, dated 1884 to 1885, the years leading up to Samuel's death. She settled on a dusty crate, her eyes scanning the entries. Eleanor's words were vivid, painting a picture of a family fractured by suspicion and greed. One passage, dated June 1884, caught her attention. Father grows worse daily, his temper fraying. Samuel suspects the accounts are falsified, but Edward forbids him to speak of it. I fear what will happen if the truth comes out. Mary weeps constantly, her health fading. I have seen the gardener with a stranger at dusk, near the yew tree. Something is being planned, and I am powerless to stop it. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Edward Blackthorne, the stern patriarch, and Samuel, probing into family secrets. The mention of the yew tree, where Samuel's grave now stood, was chilling. She turned the pages, finding another entry, dated January 1885, just months before Samuel's death. Samuel is determined to confront Edward. He believes our brother has betrayed us all, selling land that was not his to sell. I begged him to leave, to take Mary and go, but he refuses. Last night, I saw the same stranger again, watching the house. I fear for Samuel's life. The diary ended abruptly, its final pages blank. Miss Marple closed it, her mind racing. Eleanor's words suggested a betrayal within the family, possibly tied to financial deceit. Samuel's death, listed as cause unknown, now seemed suspiciously convenient, and Mary's death a year later might have been its aftermath. The roses, blooming on their graves and others, could be a mark of vengeance or guilt, placed by someone who knew the truth. As she tucked the diary into her bag, a faint noise echoed below. A door creaking, followed by the soft tread of footsteps. Miss Marple froze, her heart steady, but her senses alert. The manor was not as abandoned as it seemed. She slipped the chest back under the curtains and moved to the attic door, peering down the stairs. The footsteps grew louder, pausing at the base of the attic steps. Gripping her umbrella, Miss Marple descended quietly, her eyes fixed on the shadows below. As she reached the landing, she glimpsed a figure in a dark cloak, their face obscured, slipping into the study. The same cloaked figure Daniel had seen in the churchyard. She followed, her steps silent, and peered through the study's cracked door. The figure was rifling through the desk, their movements frantic, as if searching for something specific. Miss Marple considered confronting them, but hesitated. Alone in the manor, with no one aware of her presence, caution was wiser. She retreated, slipping down the stairs and out through the broken window, her heart pounding. The diary was a breakthrough, but the cloaked figure's presence confirmed her fears. Someone else was hunting the Blackthorn's secrets, and they were closer than she'd thought. As she hurried back to St. Mary Mead, the diary heavy in her bag, Miss Marple resolved to compare its contents with the parish records and Daniel's stories. The roses were a message, and Eleanor's words were the key. But with a cloaked figure stalking the manor and churchyard, time was running short. Chapter 9. The Stranger's Warning. Miss Jane Marple returned to her cottage under a sky bruised with storm clouds, the weight of Eleanor Blackthorne's diary in her bag matched by the unease of her encounter at the manor. The cloaked figure, searching the study with such urgency, suggested someone else was unravelling the same mystery, and they were steps ahead. She locked the diary in her writing desk, determined to study it further, but her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Cherry, wiping flour from her hands, answered and called out, "Miss Marple, there's a gentleman to see you. Says it's urgent." Miss Marple smoothed her skirt and stepped into the hall, where a man stood, his hat clutched tightly in his hands. He was middle-aged, with a weathered face and eyes that darted nervously, as if expecting pursuit. His coat was patched, and his boots bore the mud of a long journey. She didn't recognize him, a rarity in St. Mary Mead, where strangers stood out like ink blots on a clean page. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone polite but guarded. "I'm Miss Marple. How may I help you?" The man glanced over his shoulder, then stepped closer, his voice low. "Name's Robert Finch, ma'am. I've come from Lichgate, 2 towns over. Heard you've been asking about the black roses in the churchyard. I'm here to warn you. Stop your poking about, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her smile remained serene. "A warning, Mr. Finch. That's rather bold for a stranger. Perhaps you'd care to explain why the roses concern you." Finch hesitated, his fingers tightening on his hat. "I ain't here to cause trouble, ma'am, but them roses, they're tied to things best left alone. Old wrongs, bad blood. I know what happened to the Blackthorns, and I know what's stirring now. You keep digging, and you'll bring trouble on yourself and the village." Miss Marple gestured to a chair in the drawing-room, inviting him to sit. "Please, Mr. Finch, I'm an old woman with a curious mind, nothing more. If you know something about the Blackthorns, I'd be grateful for your insight. Why do you think my inquiries are dangerous?" He sat reluctantly, his eyes flicking to the window. I grew up hearing stories, same as most. The Blackthorns were powerful once, but cursed, they said, after a betrayal in the family. Someone was killed, murdered, not accidental, and it tore 'em apart. Them roses started bloomin' after, marking the graves of them what suffered. Now they're back, and it ain't no accident. Someone's raking up the past, and they don't want you interfering. Miss Marple's mind flashed to the anonymous letter, the cloaked figure, and Eleanor's diary. And who might this someone be, Mr. Finch? Have you seen them? Perhaps a person in a cloak, visiting the churchyard at night? Finch's face paled, and he stood abruptly. I've said too much already. I came to warn you, that's all. Leave the roses be, Miss Marple, for your own good. He turned to leave, but paused at the door, his voice dropping to a whisper. Check the old well behind the manor. Might be something there you need to see. Before she could press him, Finch was gone, his footsteps fading down the lane. Miss Marple stood, her mind racing. His warning echoed the anonymous letter, but his mention of the well was new, a clue she couldn't ignore. Lichgate was a small town, not far, and she wondered if Finch was connected to the Blackthorns, or simply a meddler with half-remembered tales. Either way, his fear was real, and it matched Daniel's and Tom Griggs. She returned to her desk, pulling out Eleanor's diary to cross-reference Finch's story. The diary's entries about a betrayal and a stranger near the yew tree aligned with his account, but the well was unmentioned. Miss Marple made a note to investigate it, though the manor's grounds were vast and overgrown, and finding an old well would take time. She also considered Finch's origins. Lichgate might hold records or gossip about the Blackthorns' extended family, perhaps a descendant stirring the past. As evening fell, Miss Marple resolved to visit the churchyard, again hoping to catch the cloaked figure. She dressed warmly, tucking a small torch into her pocket, and slipped out after supper, when the village was quiet. The churchyard was bathed in moonlight, the black roses stark against the graves. She hid behind a yew tree, her eyes fixed on Samuel Blackthorn's plot, where Daniel had seen the figure. Hours passed, her patience tested by the cold, but just past midnight a shadow moved near the church wall. A cloaked figure, their face hidden, knelt by Samuel's grave, placing a fresh black rose on the soil. Miss Marple strained to see more, but the figure was cautious, glancing around before etching a small rose symbol in the dirt, a mark like the ones she'd found. Then, as swiftly as they appeared, they vanished into the shadows, leaving Miss Marple with a pounding heart and a new resolve. The figure was real, their actions deliberate. Finch's warning, the diary, the roses, all pointed to a truth buried in the Blackthorn legacy. Tomorrow she would search for the well and dig deeper into Lichgate's records. But for now, she returned home. The image of the cloaked figure burned into her mind, a reminder that the mourner's curse, whether real or not, was far from finished. Chapter 10. The Midnight Bloom. Miss Jane Marple woke with a renewed sense of purpose, the memory of the cloaked figure in the churchyard sharp in her mind. The sight of them placing a black rose and etching a symbol by Samuel Blackthorn's grave confirmed her suspicions. Someone was orchestrating the rose's appearances, tying them to a long-buried wrong. Robert Finch's warning and his cryptic Mention of the old well behind Blackthorn Manor lingered, but it was the figure's ritualistic actions that drove her to act. She needed to witness the Rose's behaviour herself, to see if they held clues beyond their eerie presence. After breakfast, Miss Marple reviewed Eleanor Blackthorn's diary, searching for references to the manor's grounds or the well. A passing mention of the old well, where secrets are kept, caught her eye, though no details followed. She made a note to search the manor's overgrown gardens, but first she resolved to return to the churchyard at night. The cloaked figures' visit suggested the Roses might reveal something under moonlight, perhaps a pattern or mark only visible then. She spent the day discreetly inquiring about Robert Finch in St. Mary Mead, but no one knew of him, and a call to a friend in Lichgate yielded little. Finch was a common name, and no one recalled a man matching his description tied to the Blackthorns. Frustrated but undeterred, Miss Marple prepared for her vigil, dressing in a dark shawl and sturdy shoes, her torch and notebook at the ready. She told Cherry she was visiting Mrs. Bantry, a plausible excuse to slip out unnoticed. The churchyard was silent as she arrived just before midnight, the air heavy with the scent of damp grass. She positioned herself behind the same yew tree, its branches shielding her from view. The graves of Samuel Blackthorn, Mary Blackthorn, Eliza Thorne, Jonathan Harrow, Margaret Clements, and now Mrs. Langley stood stark under the moon's pale glow, the black roses gleaming like ink against the stones. As the church clock struck 12, a faint rustle drew her attention. No cloaked figure appeared, but the roses themselves seemed to shift, their petals trembling as if stirred by an unseen breeze. Miss Marple crept closer, her torch off to preserve her night vision, and knelt by Samuel's grave. To her astonishment, a new rosebud was forming, its stem pushing through the soil with unnatural speed, its petals unfurling in seconds. The bloom was flawless, black as midnight, and as it opened fully, she saw something extraordinary. Faint, silvery lines etched into the petals, forming a single word. Betrayed. Her breath caught. She checked the other graves, finding the same phenomenon. Each rose, newly bloomed or blooming, bore a word. Wronged on Mary's, silenced on Eliza's, deceived on Harrow's, hidden on Clement's, and known on Mrs. Langley's. The words were fleeting, fading as the petals settled, visible only in the moment of blooming. Miss Marple scribbled them in her notebook, her hand steady despite her racing heart. The roses were not just markers. They were messages, accusing or confessing, tied to the deaths they adorned. She lingered, hoping the cloaked figure would appear, but the churchyard remained empty. The rose's midnight bloom was a revelation, but it raised new questions. Who knew the roses would reveal these words? Was the cloaked figure planting them to expose a truth, or to taunt those who noticed? And how did the well, as Finch suggested, fit into this? As she returned home, the village cloaked in darkness, Miss Marple's mind turned to the manor. The well might hold physical evidence, a letter, a relic or something tied to the Blackthorn betrayal Eleanor's diary described. She resolved to search for it at dawn, when the light was better and the manor less likely to harbour prowlers. But the words on the roses, betrayed, wronged, silenced, deceived, hidden, known, echoed like a litany, each a piece of the puzzle. Back in her cottage, She locked the door and sat by the fire, her notebook open. The diary's entries about Edward Blackthorne's deceit and Samuel's suspicions aligned with the Rose's accusations. Mrs. Langley's grave, marked with known, was particularly intriguing. A gossip? She might have known something about the Blackthorne scandal, perhaps silenced by her death. Miss Marple made a note to ask Mrs. Bantry about Langley's old stories, which often held kernels of truth. As she prepared for bed, a faint creak outside her window made her pause. She peered through the curtains, but saw only shadows. The cloaked figure, Finch's warning, and the anonymous letter loomed large, reminders that her investigation was drawing attention. Tomorrow she would find the well and confront the past head-on. But tonight she slept with her umbrella by the bed, its sturdy handle a small comfort against the gathering storm. Chapter 11. The Truth Unravelled. Miss Jane Marple rose at dawn, her mind sharpened by the revelations of the midnight bloom. The words etched on the black roses, betrayed, wronged, silenced, deceived, hidden, known, were a cipher, each pointing to a truth about the deaths they marked. Eleanor Blackthorne's diary, with its hints of betrayal and murder, and Robert Finch's mention of the old well behind the manor, suggested the final pieces of the puzzle lay at Blackthorne Manor. She dressed quickly, packing her notebook, torch, and the diary, determined to find the well and confront the legacy of the mourner's curse. The manor's grounds were damp with morning mist as she arrived, the air thick with the scent of decay. She navigated the overgrown gardens, her eyes scanning for signs of a well. After an hour of searching, she found it hidden beneath a tangle of ivy, a low stone structure, its wooden cover rotted but intact. With effort, she pried the cover aside, revealing a dark shaft. Her torch beam caught something glinting below, a metal box wedged against the well's inner wall. Using a fallen branch, Miss Marple carefully hooked the box and pulled it up. It was rusted but locked, its surface engraved with the Blackthorne crest. She tucked it into her bag, unwilling to open it in the open, and hurried back to her cottage, sensing the weight of discovery. At home, she used a letter opener to jimmy the lock, revealing a bundle of letters and a small sealed vial of dried black petals, roses, she suspected, preserved from long ago. The letters were from Edward Blackthorne, addressed to an unnamed recipient, dated 1884-1885. They were damning, detailing a scheme to sell family land illegally, forging documents to cut Samuel and Mary out of their inheritance. One letter, dated just before Samuel's death, was chilling. Samuel suspects. He must be silenced or we lose everything. The herbalist has what we need. Miss Marple's heart sank. The herbalist could be Margaret Clements, later Widow Clements, whose grave bore the rose marked hidden. The vial of petals suggested poison, perhaps crafted by Clements, used to kill Samuel and weaken Mary, whose health declined after his death. Eliza Thorne, marked silenced, might have witnessed something. Her accidental fall a cover-up. Jonathan Harrow, deceived, could have been an accomplice, paid off, but later eliminated. Mrs. Langley, known, likely uncovered the truth through gossip. Her death too convenient. The roses, blooming now, were a reckoning, placed by someone who knew the Blackthorne's crimes. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the cloaked figure. Their ritualistic placement of roses and etchings suggested a descendant or someone tied to the victims, seeking justice. She recalled Daniel's fear and Finch's warning, but neither fit the figure's deliberate actions. The diary named Eleanor as a witness to the betrayal, and parish records showed she'd left St. Mary Mead after Mary's death, her fate unknown. Could a descendant of Eleanor be behind the roses? Determined to end the mystery, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Bantry, probing for gossip about Eleanor's family. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager, recalled a rumour. Eleanor had a daughter, raised in Lichgate, who returned to St. Mary Mead years later under a new name. The name struck Miss Marple. Clara Weston, a quiet widow living on the village's edge, rarely seen but known for her garden of rare flowers. That evening, Miss Marple called on Clara Weston, her notebook and the box of letters in hand. Clara, a frail woman with sharp eyes, welcomed her warily. Miss Marple wasted no time placing the letters on the table. Mrs. Weston, I believe you're Eleanor Blackthorne's daughter. You've been placing the black roses, haven't you, to expose Edward Blackthorne's crimes? Clara's face paled, but she didn't deny it. My mother told me everything, she said softly. Edward poisoned Samuel, drove Mary to her death, and silenced others who knew. Mother kept those. Petals, proof of the poison, but she was too afraid to act. I found her diary and the letters after she died. I bred the roses using her notes to mark the graves and tell the truth. Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle. And the notes? The warnings? To protect you, Clara said. I feared you'd draw attention to me before I finished. The roses were my mother's justice, her way to honour the wronged. Miss Marple sighed, understanding Clara's pain, but wary of her methods. The truth is out now, Clara. Let the roses fade. The village needn't live under this shadow. Clara nodded, tears in her eyes. I'll stop. The last rose was for Mrs. Langley. It's done. Miss Marple left, the box of letters destined for the authorities. Clara's confession tied the threads, Edward's betrayal, the murders, the roses as a silent accusation. As she walked home, she felt the weight of the mourner's curse lift, though the cost of truth was never light. Chapter 12. The Roses Fade. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room, the morning sun filtering through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the floor. Her notebook lay closed on the table, its pages filled with the unravelling of the Blackthorne mystery. The box of Edward Blackthorne's letters, along with the vial of dried rose petals, had been handed to the local constable, who promised to investigate the historical crimes, though time had dulled the edges of justice. Clara Weston's confession had brought the mourner's curse into the light, and with it an end to the Black Rose's silent accusations. The village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with the news, as gossip inevitably spread. Mrs. Bantry, calling for tea the previous day, had been agog, her eyes wide as Miss Marple recounted the tale, carefully omitting Clara's identity to protect the widow's privacy. Poison Jane, and those roses, marking the graves like some ghostly judge, it's straight out of a novel. Miss Marple had smiled, letting Dolly's enthusiasm run its course, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on the human cost of secrets kept too long. She rose, donning her hat and scarf, and made her way to the churchyard one final time. The air was crisp, autumn's chill settling over the village, and the graves stood quiet under a sky of unbroken blue. Miss Marple approached the plots she knew so well: Samuel Blackthorne, Mary Blackthorne, Eliza Thorne, Jonathan Harrow, Margaret, Clements, and Mrs. Langley. The black roses, once vibrant and accusing, were wilting, their petals curling and falling to the earth. No new buds formed, and the faint etchings in the soil had faded, as if the graves themselves were ready to rest. Tom Griggs, tending a nearby bed of chrysanthemums, tipped his cap as she approached. "Mornin', Miss Marple. Them roses. They're dying off, just like that. Never thought I'd be glad to see flowers go." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on Samuel's grave, where a single withered rose clung to its stem. "They've served their purpose, Mr. Griggs. Sometimes the past needs to speak before it can be silent." He grunted, returning to his work, and Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts on Clara Weston. The widow had promised to let the roses fade, and it seemed she'd kept her word. Miss Marple had visited her again, ensuring Clara understood the need for discretion. The village didn't need to know her role, only that the mystery was solved. Clara, weary but relieved, had agreed, her garden of rare blooms now free of the black roses she'd bred, to honour her mother's pain. As Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, she passed Blackthorne Manor, its crumbling facade a reminder of the family's fall. The well, now covered again, held no more secrets, and the manor's shadows seemed less oppressive in the daylight. She wondered about Eleanor Blackthorne, whose diary had sparked the truth, and the daughter who'd carried her burden. Justice, Miss Marple knew, was rarely tidy, but closure was its own reward. Back home, she settled in her armchair, picking up her knitting. The pale blue shawl was nearly finished, its stitches a quiet counterpoint to the turmoil of the past. Weeks. Cherry bustled in, setting a tray of tea and biscuits on the table. "All quiet now, miss?" she asked, her eyes curious. "For now, Cherry," Miss Marple said, her smile faint but warm. "But St. Mary Mead has a way of surprising us." As Cherry left, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the church spire stood sentinel, over the village. The black roses were gone, their message delivered, but she knew human nature too well to believe all secrets were spent. Greed, betrayal, and grief were as old as the graves, and though the mourner's curse had faded, others might bloom in time. For now, she sipped her tea, her needles clicking softly, content to watch and wait for the next whisper of mystery.